Okay, welcome back to part 3 for this week's lecture. We're going to try and wrap up the rest of the chapter in this lecture. So we're going to start with talking about the cultural geography of this region. We touched on it a little bit in the introduction. This really is the heart of the Islamic and Arab worlds. While if you remember, like in some of the facts that have popped up during the first class, for example, with the geographic literacy, we talked about the country with the largest Muslim population is actually Indonesia, which is not in this region. And there are a lot of Muslim countries, or predominantly Islamic countries, Muslim countries that we are outside of this region. This is largely what we would refer to technically as the heart of the Islamic as well as Arab worlds. They are different. Islamic refers to the religion, and Arab refers to like the ethnic group. However, there is a lot of cultural diversity. Even linguistically, Arabic in one country is not necessarily mutually intelligible to Arabic in another country. The dialects can be so distinct. We also see a lot of differing religious views among Muslims, predominantly between the Sunnis and the Shiites. And another thing we see is non-Arab peoples do still dominate some parts of the region. However, the majority is Arabs as well as Muslim. So here's just a map of modern religions in the region. Again, you can see the the majority is Sunni Islam, followed by Shiite Islam. I'm not going to go into this difference. Your book does talk about it. It's kind of like if you think about, most of you are probably more familiar with Christianity. Christianity and Judaism basically differentiated between the fact that Jesus was considered the Messiah and Jesus is not considered the Messiah. So very similar. I believe I'd have to go back and I forgot what it says exactly. I think it has to do with Muhammad and who would take over as kind of the next prophet. So in a country like Iraq, a lot of, if you actually read something regarding current tensions in Iraq, or in the last few years, Sunni versus Shiite is something that you might have actually come across those terms. Again, we tend to just clump, if you are not familiar with Muslim populations and Islamic religion, we tend to just clump everyone together, but that's just the same as basically saying Christian. There can be quite a few differences between the Christian, different sectors and denominations of Christianity as well. Judaism, the little pocket up there in Israel. Animism, we talked about that before, pretty much down there in the very southern parts of Sudan. We talked about that when we learned about Sub-Saharan Africa. And then you can see the letters, so we do still have little pockets of other populations. Again, some pockets of largely Christian, Druze, and Sufisms, which are also like more animistic religions as well. So some other patterns of religion. Again, this is the hearth for the world's largest religions, for Christianity, for Muslim or for Islam as well. It's the hearth of the Judeo-Christian tradition. So again, this concept of monotheism, which we don't really necessarily think about, but it had to come from somewhere, and this is the hearth for a monotheistic religion. The emergence of Islam also came from this region. You can see there specifically where the hearth was, and it spread. This is regarding Islam, so Islamic beliefs. It was a few hundred years after the beginning of the Christian era, so in 0 AD. And you can see how it spread, much similar to what we've seen with even Christianity. Is something there's a really cool map that I show in Geography 2000 where you can see the axis, like where the center point of Christianity. So it starts like this, where the birthplace of Christianity was in Jerusalem, and it spreads and it goes up like this, and it's somewhere down here. So is what you can actually see by this. It's not saying that this specific dot is the birthplace, but it shows you that as the dot moves further this way, you see that it's being, more people, what we'd call in the Western Hemisphere, are becoming Christian, and as it's spread to South America, and then now we're seeing this progressive change back here in the Orient, potentially Africa as well. So you can see here that this has spread quite a bit. There's a lot of regions that are the striped regions, for example, that previously were under Muslim dominance that no longer are as well. And then here, what we talked about, we do have a lot of Southeast Asia, which we'll talk about when we get to that region. So just to give you a little bit quick information, there's basically a lot of times, there's 5 essential activities. This is one of the main characteristics regarding Islam. So there's 5 essential activities that Muslims are supposed to engage in throughout their lifetime. This can be daily, this can be once a year, like for example, making a pilgrimage to the Hajj or to Mecca. You're supposed to do it once in your lifetime. Allah is the only God. So again, it's a monotheistic religion, meaning there's one God. You're supposed to pray 5 times a day at specific times, facing towards Mecca. And you're supposed to make charitable contributions. So again, the concept of like altruism, which we'd find in Christianity. And then you're supposed to participate in Ramadan, which is a month of fasting, usually during daylight hours. And then there's, I've had friends explain intricacies of Ramadan. It's a very interesting religious practice as well. A lot of times we also, when we hear of, especially regarding the discourse regarding immigrants, refugees, Muslims, terrorists in the United States, we have oftentimes, at least at a larger mainstream level, in Islamic fundamentalism, which is not representative of a mainstream Islam. But it's very, it's what we refer to as terrorist groups or specific governments that, or not even more than a theocratic state, but the Taliban, for example, Al-Qaeda are fundamentalists. It's not a descriptor for all Muslims. So within this region, we do see Muslim majorities in all countries except for Israel, which is not that big of a shocker, I guess you say. And as we saw, there is a huge division within Islam. So Sunnis make up about 73%, and Shiite Muslims make up about 23%. You notice that does not make up 100%, and there are a few other Islamic sects, much smaller. And then another very huge political component of this region is Jerusalem, which has strong ties and sacred. It's considered a sacred space. We don't talk about it too much in this book or in this course, but I talk about sacred space a lot when we talk about religion in Geography 2000, if you're interested for next semester. When we talk about sacred space, Jerusalem is, there's a lot of sacred sites, and not just specific sites, but the area with its historical meaning for both Christianity as well as for Judaism. And this has been a bit of a political, I'm not even sure, hot topic, I'd say. It's probably just the best way to put it. When President Trump recently, I think it was last year, declared that they would be moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem because Israel wanted to recognize Jerusalem as the capital, but the rest of the world refuses to acknowledge that. So it's a very interesting topic if you're interested in reading some more about it. So language, there are a variety of languages. Again, what I previously mentioned, what is a lot of people aren't aware of is that Arabic is not necessarily always mutually intelligible. A lot of people also just think everyone in this region must speak Arabic, even in predominantly Muslim countries, and that's not so. There's a lot of other languages as well. So some of the geopolitical issues we're going to talk about here, we'll touch on Arab Spring, which started in 2010, and basically started here in Tunisia, and it basically moved across the southern Mediterranean region. It got to Libya. By 2011, they were actually able to overthrow the president, and that has resulted in a lot of issues now with the government. They still haven't really been able to replace the government. There's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of issues. This is where we've briefly mentioned as well. There's this emerging slave trade that got a lot of attention last year, was put on social media. And then Arab Spring continued until what we saw resulted in the Syrian civil war. So it was people protesting against the government, and in that case, the government cracked down against the people. Partially inspired by what they'd seen in other countries, they continued, and then became this point where the world wasn't really sure what to do. If we go back to talking about who's on the Security Council for the United Nations, we're on the table, as we've mentioned. China's on the table, and Russia, and both of those countries tend to ally with Syria. So anytime that some countries, for example, the United States, if we have proposed to get involved, it's in their best interest that we don't get involved because they have strong alliances with the Syrian government. If we were to get involved and overthrow the Syrian government, that would obviously present a shift in political power within the world and their relationships that they're going to have. As soon as there was a rebel army that started defending the people and fighting back against the government's army, basically, sadly, the world was kind of able to take this huge sigh of relief. I should say not necessarily the world, but governments, because what do we do? People allegedly are being massacred by their government, by their president. What do we do? How can we not get involved? But at the same time, how do we get involved without causing more conflicts in other countries? This is something a lot of us, a lot of people don't even realize. And we see the people in the news, and I'm not justifying this by any means, but we see these people suffering, refugees, children, people dying, people begging for food. And the world just stands there and does pretty much nothing for the most part. And I'm just but why? Why are we doing nothing? And the fact is that when the government, or when the rebels retaliated against the government, it was declared a civil war, because now it's more or less technically not. I mean, it is. It's an internal conflict. It's not like one group is trying to become a separatist, to separate from the rest of the government. It's more of a defense from, at least it was. So yeah, it's a very complicated mess. And with that, we've seen the growth and the emergence of ISIS, or ISIL, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. The actual status of ISIS, I'm not sure. Most of the reports I found is that it's been overthrown, but it seems almost too good to be true. Some of the other things that we're seeing in this, obviously, if you're aware of the nuclear tensions and nuclear facilities, and a lot of the tensions with the United States, Sudan, there was the last 10 years, there's been a genocide between Sudan and South Sudan, which eventually led to the separation of South Sudan. So there's a few different issues in this country. A lot of times we associate this country with just being very conflicting, very at war, very, if I were to offer you a free ticket tomorrow to Iraq, would you want to go? I think the images that most of us conjure in our minds are nothing positive. Yet it helps, and we'll talk about a little bit here, it helps to understand it wasn't always this way. You can even look back at pictures, and we talk about South Asia, for example, or the next region, when we talk about Afghanistan and Pakistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, you can even see for a lot of these countries, Syria. If you look back just a couple of decades ago, life was very different for a lot of these countries. But if we want to go beyond that and understand a little bit more, we'll look at some of the colonial history. So some of this, again, what we often associate, what we often imagine for this region of this never-ending tensions. So Arab Spring rebellions, which has led to overthrow in some countries, such as Libya, we just talked about, which has created this huge state of conflict and just, corruption, and there really still is no instability, I should say. A lot of sectarian conflicts or religious conflicts between Sunnis and Shiites, for example. Another common one that we often associate with this region, Israeli-Palestinian relations. And again, this isn't a religious conflict, it's actually an ethnic conflict. And another huge tension we see in this country, within a country and then within the region, is huge disparity between the distribution of wealth and poverty. So to recap, your book does a pretty good job of summing up the colonial legacy. Here's just an example of Iraq. So what we have is, you can see here, we have the Sunni Arab, we have the Shiite Arab, and then we have Kurds. The Kurds are an interesting group. I believe we've talked about them before. We talked about nation and state, and basically it's a people without a state. Because they're spread out among a variety of countries. But this is very similar as to what we saw. Well, it's a little bit different. Basically, after World War I, there was this British Mandate system, and a lot of these lands, would have been owned or controlled by other countries, and they were promised during World War I. It was Britain largely promising, I think it was like Israel, for example, promising what was Palestine. They were promising it to a variety of countries. And in the end, they quote unquote caved, I suppose you could say, and gave it to the Zionist movement, gave it to what are now Israelis. It was a country that was created, right? So similar with Iraq. So a lot of these countries, their boundaries and their borders were formed less than 100 years ago. And then while it wasn't so much a colony as we'd say with Africa, as what we saw with Sub-Saharan Africa, the legacies still exist, and a lot of the tensions can still exist because we're forming boundaries and putting people in places where they might not naturally, quote unquote, I suppose, like fall. So again, it's a similar situation of what we're going to see and what we'll continue to see with Asia as well. So just to kind of recap here, I already talked about some of these issues. So with Libya, we have a very divided government today. They overthrew the government, and a stable government hasn't been established. Egypt, politically speaking, it still is a very unstable country. Sudan, we saw a coup and a civil war, followed by a secession. So the south separated from the north. So now you have Sudan and South Sudan. I'm not really going to go into the Arab-Israeli conflict very well. Your book does a really great job of doing this. And then I'm attaching a link here for a YouTube video, which also sums it up really well. But you can see here from the map that with the British Mandate system that was established after World War I, and then again it was extended after World War II, there was a Jewish state and an Arab Muslim state. So you can see here we had Palestine, where Gaza and Jerusalem both are up here in the top left. And then over time, we saw there was a shift, right? So this was all, Palestine was technically all Palestine, but it was under the British Mandate system. And then it was more divided very unnaturally in between a Jewish state and an Arab Muslim state. And then there was several wars throughout the region. For a while, Israel had actually, quote unquote, taken over, captured, you would say, the whole entire Sinai Peninsula, which was later returned. It's really interesting. I mean, a lot of people aren't aware we actually pay billions, I believe it is, of dollars of buyouts to these countries, Egypt being one of them. We actually pay these countries to maintain peace and to be nice to their neighbors. But anyways, take a couple minutes, watch this video, make sure to read this section of your book. It's very, very interesting. And again, I can't stress enough that this isn't a religious conflict. This isn't a religious war. It's often framed that way. We often associate it that way, but it's not. So again, there's some really good videos that can just sum this up so much better than I can. We did talk a little bit about civil war in Syria. So again, I'm just going to leave you here, go ahead and push pause, go ahead and watch this it's a pretty short YouTube video that sums it up. And then Iraq, these are a lot of, I can't stress enough that all of these problems, as you guys are going to be graduating, as you guys are going into the workforce, you guys, hopefully some of you will be inspired to go into politics. These are problems that you guys are inheriting. These are problems that were created, although the Syrian civil war is quite new. The Iraq conflicts in the Persian Gulf, we would say the Persian Gulf War 1 and 2, these have been going on well before the 1990s, well before the 80s. And then there's a couple quick videos here I have regarding ISIS as well. Again, and I don't really know what exactly is going on right now with ISIS. I've heard the reports and seen the reports that allegedly it no longer exists. I find that really hard to believe, and I find that hard to believe because, well, ISIS wasn't necessarily a government of a country. We haven't been able to get rid of or eradicate other terrorist groups. So I don't understand quite how we being world population, have been so successful with ISIS. So anyways, take a couple minutes, please watch those videos, make sure to read this section in your book. So some economic and social development trends that we see in this country. Wealthy countries in this region, their wealth is largely related to rich reserves of oil and gas. That is their primary exporting and their basis for their economy. The other nations that aren't so lucky to have those fossil fuels are among the world's least developed. We see a lot of instability regarding politics in this country, and that has resulted in a lot of economic struggles for many of these countries. However, we do see in a lot of these countries is they want to participate in a global market and they want to quote unquote develop. We're seeing more of an interest in broadening the economic base. Now remember, even if a country has a lot of natural gas and oil, it can be very dangerous at the same time. So we say by broadening the economic base, meaning that think about if you're just exporting crude oil. Well, one thing is exporting crude oil, which if you go back to our 4 levels of economic activities, it's a primary activity. But then now let's say you process the oil, you refine it into different fractions, so into gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, kerosene, etc., etc. And then what if you can manufacture, so paraffin, for example, which is the heaviest. I worked on a biofuels project a year ago. I know way too much about fossil fuels, but anyways, the paraffin, which is the base, which is the heaviest based on the amount of carbon molecules that is attached. We use to make wax, or we use to make candles, for example, or you can mix it with certain chemicals, and then that's how we make plastic, depending on different kinds of plastic you want. So you can go up and up and up, and then you could do research on this, for example. So broadening the economic base, although while all of the base and all of the activities that I'm referring to are technically related to this extraction and production of this fuel, we're seeing more broadening bases. Some regions like UAE are trying to build up a financial tourism sectors as well. So it's always in countries' best interest to try and broaden their base. Economic and social development. So we've got, again, our basic development indicators, our list of countries, so GNI, which is basically your GDP, but kind of more on a international currency. You can see some countries are phenomenal. Qatar, 128,000. Kuwait, 84, almost 85,000. And then you have some countries like Sudan and Yemen, which are only 3,000. Huge disparity. So GDP, your average annual growth rate, you can see some of these countries, Libya, for example, this is in 2009 to 2013, so 2010 was when Arab Spring started. Sudan has had a lot of conflict in this area, this region, or sorry, this time frame as well. We've seen a huge drop. Again, Qatar, not surprisingly, is a 10.2 increase, so that's a huge increase, annual growth rate. Human Development Index, relatively speaking, it's not too bad. Again, there's a pretty clear correlation. Israel has the highest one, which we'll talk about. This is an indicator for Israel. They do have some of the highest human development standards and indicators for this region. Percent of the population living below $2 a day. Algeria is pretty high. Sudan is almost 50%. Yemen is almost 40%. It's phenomenal, right? And then we have some countries, a lot of countries, probably about half where it's zero. And again, if I had to ask you which countries do you think have large reserves of fossil fuels, it's not too difficult to figure out. Life expectancy is pretty average across. Israel's at 82. Again, that's not too much of a surprise. And then the poorer countries, the countries that aren't doing so well on the Human Development Index, are down in the low 60s. Under age 5 mortality rate for 1990. So this is the rate, so it's per 1,000. Quite high for some of them, quite low for others. But yet for all of them, we have seen a huge reduction from 1990 to 2013. Youth literacy rates. Some countries, Israel represents 100. Libya, I'm not sure how accurate this is, also declares that they have 100%. And then some countries, we've got Iraq is down as low as 82. Morocco is 82. And gender inequality. This is quite atrocious for some countries. You can see the huge disparity. Israel's at 0.1, Kuwait's at 0.2, Libya is at 0.2, and then we have Yemen is 0.7. Egypt is almost 0.6, so huge disparity here between gender equality within the region. So to quickly touch up on, increase that back up, I don't know if that affects your screen or not, sorry if it does. This is geography of fossil fuels. What we do see around the world, and this gives you a global map, and then I'll give you a more specific map, we see a really uneven distribution of resources within the region, as well as within the world, right? So this is natural gas and crude oil production. Production is not quite the same as where reserves are found. There is a difference. So you can see for production, we actually produce as much crude oil as Saudi Arabia, as Russia, up there, like some of the highest ranks. Natural gas, we also produce, we have high amounts. However, the amount that we actually have in proven reserves is quite different. I've got a bigger map here to show. But in general, for the world's entire crude oil supply, Saudi Arabia has almost 20% of proven reserves. There are other regions where we believe there's reserves, but they haven't been proven yet. So that's what we refer to when we say proven reserves. And with this, there's a really uneven distribution of supply and demand. A lot of the countries that actually have the fossil fuels are not consuming the fossil fuels. We consume more fossil fuels than pretty much any other country. North Africa and Southwest Asia has 7% of the world's population, so this region, but holds 60% of the world's proven petroleum reserves. 12% of the world reserve is in the hands of industrialized countries. So the countries that are using the most have the less. 75% of consumption of fossil fuels is by industrialized countries. So here you can see this is based on 2008. So this is proven reserves on the left. So the green is this region, Southwest Asia and North Africa. This is who has the oil. So it's probably what, maybe 70%. And the tan color is the rest of the world. So we have about 2%. Saudi Arabia, there is about 26%. And then on the right, we have natural gas. So this region does have a much smaller amount of natural gas. But, if we took Russia out of the picture, then they would have you can see they still have, Iran has a much higher number than we do. Okay, OPEC. This is something I really want you to remember and to learn about. OPEC is a huge factor in controlling how much our gas costs. It means the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. It is a trade cartel. When we think of cartel, we often think of the drug cartel, which that is a cartel. It just happens to be for a different product. A cartel refers to an organization of a producer with a purpose of coordinating their production levels in order to maximize and stabilize returns to their production. They essentially are wanting to create a monopoly and control the market. If they can control the market, they can control the prices. So this is an organization of countries who hold large amounts of petroleum, not all of the petroleum. You'll see back here, for example, if we go back here, Venezuela is part of there. If I'm not mistaken, Nigeria is. I'll show you on the next map. Ecuador is part of OPEC as well. So it's not necessarily how much you have, but there's other factors involved. We are not. So 12 current members of Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Libya, Nigeria, Qatar, Algeria, Angola, and Ecuador. These countries control 81% of proven reserves, produce 44% of the world's crude oil, and they trade 60% of their oil in the global market. Or I should say, sorry, they control and trade 60% of the oil in the global market. Now, OPEC influences how much our oil costs. They can control how much is produced, how much is sold, and by doing so, they can actually control the price of the barrel. By controlling the price, then that trickles down to influencing how much we pay for gas and diesel, etc. So this is the distribution of the 12 countries. So again, this region is a powerhouse. The majority, we talked about 12, right? 1, 2, 3, 4 other countries are not in this region. This is just another way of looking at it. OPEC share of crude oil reserves. So again, only about 19%. And these are, reserves can change, but OPEC controlled approximately, this looks about billions of barrels produced, so 81%. And then you can see how this distribution was made within that. So Venezuela, while having a much smaller reserve, actually produced what looks to be the biggest chunk. So there are a lot of factors that have influenced this. If you remember in the last couple of years, the price of, trying to think when this was, 2012, 2013 maybe, the United States have been investing in technology in the north, and it finally paid off. It was, I can't remember, it was like tar sands or oil sands. But basically, the technology finally paid off, and we were able to all of a sudden flood the market with our petroleum. By doing that, we were actually able to influence the prices, and that means we were able to drop the prices. And then, so this has created this continual system, and that's one of the things that has me wondering now, as prices have been going up, if there's this change in power, if somehow we have lost control of the market. Anyway, so a couple other global and regional linkages that we talk about with this region besides OPEC. There is a lot of EU trade relations, being very close to the European Union. GAFTA, so much similar to CAFTA and NAFTA. This is a free trade agreement between this area, between these states. And then there's also a lot of Islamic financial organizations that have a lot of pull. Some of the different patterns we've seen. I love this picture. You can just see these roads and they just look like they go off into nowhere. It's the picture in Saudi Arabia. So we have very high income oil exporters. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, UAE. These are countries that are making a lot of money. But you also have a lot of low income oil exporters. So Iraq, Iran, Algeria, a lot of countries that are a lot less politically stable as well. So even within the countries that do have high amounts of reserves, there's a lot of disparity as well. And then there is, so you can, Israel as well as Turkey have both demonstrated that they've been able to prosper quite well without having oil and natural gas reserves. Israel, as we saw, has one of the highest standards of living in the region. And then Turkey, your book actually provides some really good examples, has done quite well diversifying their economy in other ways, including like agriculture and manufacturing activities. However, we do see a lot of poverty in this region. On the left, you can see this. They're calling it Syria sinks into darkness. But so this is over a period of time, basically or at the early stages of the Civil War to more contemporary times. And you can see, I think we see a lot of this region and we think, oh, well, not a lot has changed. But if you really start focusing on the coast, this whole entire blip here, this line has all but disappeared. A lot of these dots have disappeared. There's just one. Again, it looks as a good indicator of where the population is distributed, right? This whole entire northern area is pretty much all black. This not being Syria. So again, a lot of these cities and towns are just kind of represents the destruction and the damage that has happened over the last several years. And then again, another good indicator of poverty, and this shows you the disparities as well, is the childhood mortality. So per 1,000 live births, this is the mortality rate. You can see Oman, UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, again, the countries that are doing much better economically speaking, have fewer than 10 per 1,000 live births. And then we have the opposite extreme, more than 30, Morocco, Sudan, Yemen, Iraq. So regarding, I love how this book always kind of wraps up each chapter with gender, culture, and politics. But it gives us a nice status of trying to understand what the status is for women, right? So in this region, we see female participation in the workforce is among the world's lowest, so rates of participation. There are still major gaps, which I think a lot of you probably won't find this surprising based on what we do read. But there's a huge gaps between male and female educational levels, and this hasn't always been the way. A lot of this is even, we could say, changes that we've seen due to globalization and outside influences. And we still do see a lot of legal restrictions in much more orthodox Islamic states, so much more traditional Islamic states. Some countries have been making quote-unquote progress, a lot of changes. I believe it was last year, women finally gained the right to be able to drive in Saudi Arabia. I don't know when that was supposed to become into effect, but the law was changed. And then, we see the complete opposite, where women are still forced to wear a veil and niqab, for example, or an entire body veil in a lot of these countries. In Iran, for example, I just read this really interesting article, and I'm not going to be able to, I want to say it was, sorry, I cannot remember the name, but it was talking about a third gender. And I believe it wasn't in this region. I believe it was Pakistan. But it makes me wonder if it is something that would actually be found in this region. And what they found is that in a more modern time, when there's a lot of disadvantages associated with being a female in these countries, a lot of families have started raising, especially families that have only had daughters. They have started raising some of their daughters from the time they're born as male. And by doing this, these females that are being raised as male are allowed to go out without being accompanied by another male in the family. And I mean, I think that's just a really good example of helping to understand the inequality that we see between men and women in much more orthodox Islamic states, much more fundamentalist states. However, we are seeing a lot of changes. So women have been very active and participative in the Arab Spring rebellions. A lot of countries, we are seeing women able to pursue more high-level careers and education opportunities. Again, as we talked about, I just mentioned this, in some countries, women are finally, Saudi Arabia, for example, women are finally able to start driving. And they're achieving more of a social position that previously more of a social acceptability in freedom regarding dress, regarding habits as well. And this is largely country to country. Here's your quick review at the end. So have a great week. Let me know if you have any questions.